A massive stone bowl in the very center of Rome always amazes anyone who sees it for the first time. From one side, the structure looks whole and incredibly powerful, rising above the city with a multi-story wall. But if you take just a few dozen steps and walk around it, the view changes dramatically. A huge section of the outer wall is simply missing, exposing inner corridors and empty spans. Looking at these uneven edges, it's hard to imagine that the amphitheater was once perfectly symmetrical and formed a closed ring. Today, only an island of its former grandeur remains, resembling a broken toy against the backdrop of modern streets. People tend to call this natural aging, but behind every empty niche and every missing block lies a specific event. Where exactly did these millions of tons of heavy stone go? And why did one side remain intact while the other turned into ruins? That remains the main mystery of this place. We will try to reconstruct the chain of events and understand how the greatest structure in human history began to literally melt away before the eyes of the city's residents. To grasp the scale of the loss, it helps to imagine the Colosseum in its original form for a moment. It was not just an arena for spectacles, but a true symbol of imperial triumph. Construction of this giant began in 70 CE and took only 8 years, an incredibly short time even by modern standards. Imagine thousands of workers delivering massive blocks of white stone to the site every day. The building was entirely faced with light-colored slabs that shone so brightly in the sun they could dazzle passers-by. Back then, the amphitheater didn't look like gray ruins. It resembled a gleaming, snow-white mountain in the middle of the city. At the same time, the builders used no cement or adhesive to connect the outer walls. The heavy stone blocks were simply stacked on top of one another, relying on their own weight and the precise fit of their edges. To keep the structure from shifting, special grooves were carved into the stones, and strong iron clamps were inserted. These fasteners stitched the building together from within, creating an invisible metal framework. About 300 tons of valuable iron went into it, metal that, centuries later, would become the target of a real hunt. Inside, everything was even more lavish. The seating for the elite was faced with pure marble, and each arch held lifelike statues of gods. On hot days, a Vishal fabric canopy was stretched over the stands to shield 50,000 spectators from the blazing sun. The Colosseum was built as a timeless structure meant to endure for centuries. But that didn't happen. When the southern wall collapsed, it ceased to be a state-owned monument and effectively became a kind of no man's land. At that point, one of the strangest periods in its history began. The vast empty arches that once served as entrances for crowds started turning into ordinary living spaces. Imagine walking through Rome at that time and seeing laundry hanging inside the greatest monument of antiquity, smoke rising from makeshift stoves, and animals roaming across the arena floor. This wasn't a one-time occupation by the homeless. A full-fledged urban neighborhood emerged inside the amphitheater, complete with its own streets and rules. People built wooden floors within the stone vaults, dividing the tall spans into 2 or 3 levels. The result was a kind of apartment. On the ground level, there might be a forge or a cobbler's workshop, while the craftsman's family lived above. Records from that time show that these spaces were officially rented out and even sold. Powerful families in the city owned entire sections of the Colosseum, much like people own shopping malls today. Inside the arches, there were not only homes but also warehouses, stables, and even small churches. The arena, where gladiators once fought, was covered with soil and turned into a vast communal garden. Residents grew vegetables and fruit there, using the ancient walls as protection from the wind. In those years, the Colosseum resembled a giant anthill, with life bustling in every surviving corner. Instead of emperors and senators, children ran along its stairways, and instead of the roar of wild beasts, there was the sound of hammers and the lowing of livestock. This kind of coexistence did not do the structure any favors. To make their homes more comfortable, people cut new doorways and windows into the ancient walls, weakening the building's structural integrity. They used marble slabs from the seating tiers as countertops or as filler to patch holes in the floors. The amphitheater gradually lost its original appearance, becoming overgrown with makeshift extensions of brick and mud. It was during this period that the structure suffered the most chaotic destruction. While authorities officially hauled away stone by cart, ordinary residents slowly wore it down from within, adapting the grand architecture to their modest daily needs. For a medieval person, the Colosseum was not a monument but simply a very convenient cliff with ready-made caves that were dry and safe to live in. This everyday colonization lasted for centuries, and it is precisely why the inner corridors today appear so jagged and uneven. Later, when people were finally evicted from the amphitheater in an effort to preserve it, archaeologists found remnants of chimneys in the walls and even traces of medieval kitchens that had literally fused into the ancient concrete. In the 11th century, one powerful Roman family even turned the amphitheater into a private fortress, bricking up many of the arches. This preserved part of the structure, but not for long. As soon as power in Rome changed hands, the new rulers decided that the Colosseum was too costly to maintain and would be better used as a source of building stone. Thus began an era historians call official dismantling. Here lies one of the most fascinating facts. The removal of stone was not simple theft. It was a well-organized state operation. There were formal contracts under which contractors had the right to take a certain number of blocks in exchange for a share of profits or services provided to the city. On the site of the collapsed southern wall, a vast open area formed, covered with rubble. People called it a stone forest. Each block was numbered and prepared for transport. If you had found yourself in Rome 500 years ago, you would have seen an endless line of ox-drawn carts slowly hauling pieces of the Colosseum to new construction sites. It looked like the gradual disappearance of a once mighty giant that could no longer resist. One of the most well-known routes led to the Tiber River, where ancient blocks were used to build port structures and reinforce the banks to protect the city from seasonal flooding. But perhaps the most remarkable reuse of the stone occurred during the construction of Palazzo Venezia. This imposing building in the heart of the city is made almost entirely from recycled Colosseum material. Its foundation, massive outer walls, and even interior structures were built from the same white stone that once formed the amphitheater's facade. When you look at its powerful walls, you are essentially seeing that missing southern wall, just in a different form. The stones didn't disappear, they simply changed addresses. The same thing happened with Palazzo Barberini. There was even a saying that what early medieval invaders failed to destroy was eventually dismantled by the Barberini family. With papal permission, this aristocratic family removed so much material that it could have built an entire district. But few people realized that parts of the Colosseum traveled even farther than these famous palaces. For example, massive blocks of travertine were used in the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, the most important church in the Catholic world. To transport such heavy stones, workers had to build temporary bridges and reinforce roads that otherwise could not withstand the weight of the ancient blocks. Even the famous Ponte Cestio, crossed daily by thousands of people, contains fragments of the Colosseum's seating tiers, hidden beneath later layers of stonework. The recycling process, however, was not always careful. While large blocks were reused, smaller fragments and decorative elements met a very different fate. Along the roads leading away from the amphitheater, special kilns were set up. Into these kilns they threw ornate marble capitals, statues and slabs, burning them down into lime. It was the cheapest way to produce high-quality mortar for building ordinary brick houses. Priceless marble was turned into lime mortar for new churches and palaces. Vast amounts of elite stone were reduced to dust and construction binder. This explains why today, inside the Colosseum, we see only a rough concrete skeleton. Everything that had any value was either incorporated into new buildings or processed in kilns for practical use. In this way, the Colosseum didn't simply disappear. It was systematically dismantled and absorbed into the very fabric of Rome. The city quite literally grew out of the fragments of its greatest symbol, turning a historic monument into the foundation of new life. But why were people so determined to dismantle this particular structure? The answer is simple: quality. The ancient Romans used extremely dense, high-grade limestone that only grew stronger with time. It was a pleasure to work with, and buildings made from it could last forever. At the same time, the concept of historical preservation, as we understand it today, simply did not exist in the city. For people of that era, the Colosseum was a relic of a dark pagan past, useful mainly as a source of materials. Its stone was even used to build staircases in ordinary homes. To this day, in the basements of old Roman buildings, you can still find distinctive curved blocks that clearly once belonged to the amphitheater's seating or corridors. Interestingly, treasure seekers were not only after the stone. The most valuable resource hidden within the walls was the very iron that once held the structure together. This marked the beginning of an era of large-scale plundering, when people deliberately broke into the walls to extract the metal clamps. If you look at the Colosseum today, you'll notice it is covered with thousands of holes. Many people think these marks are from old shells or bullets, but that's not the case. Each of those holes is the trace left by a medieval metal scavenger. People pried out iron pins and melted them down into horseshoes, knives, or tools. There was so much iron that extracting it became a full-fledged urban trade. It was dangerous, exhausting work. Metal workers used long, specialized drills. They could sense where the metal connectors were hidden inside the stone and drilled their way toward them. Sometimes the blocks cracked and collapsed, leading to fatal accidents. But the lure of profit outweighed the danger. Every piece of metal removed made the structure weaker and weaker. The Colosseum lost its internal spine and began to crumble under its own weight. From a closed ring, it gradually transformed into the horseshoe shape we recognize today. The people of that time saw nothing wrong with it. They were simply reusing the old to meet the needs of the new, unaware that they were destroying one of the greatest architectural monuments in history. At some point, the amphitheater became surrounded by urban legends and eerie stories that frightened passers-by. Local tales gave the empty corridors a mystical aura, linking them to the past. People spoke of strange sounds echoing from breaches in the walls at night. This slowed the dismantling by ordinary residents, but it did not stop the church or the aristocracy. They continued to strip away the finest marble to decorate their villas. One report from that time mentions that, in a single effort, 40 cartloads of pure white marble were removed to adorn a private fountain. It was an era when the Colosseum was literally melting under the scorching Italian sun, transforming from a perfect circle into the broken horseshoe we see today. But the building still had one more unexpected twist of fate ahead, one that would turn it from a quarry into a shrine. The most surprising transformation happened in the 16th century, when the Colosseum suddenly gained a new protector. By that time, it no longer resembled an arena but rather an abandoned forest. Trees had grown inside its arches, and the walls were covered with rare plant species that botanists studied as a unique ecosystem. The structure was literally dying, and locals had begun using it as a dump. Then Pope Benedict XIV intervened. He made a move that today would be called brilliant PR. To stop the looting, he declared the Colosseum a site of Christian martyrdom. Modern historians note that there is little direct evidence of mass executions taking place specifically there. However, this sacred status helped preserve the walls. In an instant, the Colosseum went from a free quarry to an open-air church. Crosses were installed along its walls, and removing stone was equated with desecration. It was one of the first times in history that an ancient structure was protected not for its beauty, but out of fear of divine punishment. It is thanks to this protection that we can still see at least half of the facade today. Without this religious shield, the last stones of the Colosseum would likely have long ago become someone's foundation or fence. Yet even after it was placed under protection, the building continued to reveal surprises. In the 19th century, when the first scientific excavations began, archaeologists discovered an entire system of lifts and trapdoors beneath the arena. These mechanisms allowed wild animals and stage scenery to be suddenly raised onto the stage, creating a dramatic, almost magical effect. It's hard to imagine that beneath the floor where people once stood lay a highly complex technical system, where hundreds of workers operated the machinery to stage the games. These underground levels have survived far better than the outer walls, because they remained buried under debris and earth for years, effectively preserving them for history. Today, when we look at the hollow eye sockets of its arches, we understand that the missing half of the Colosseum didn't simply vanish into nothing. It dissolved into Rome itself. It lives on in the stones of St. Peter's Basilica, in bridges over the Tiber River, and in the bricks of private villas. The city quite literally absorbed its greatest landmark to rebuild itself. For a long time, People couldn't understand why the Colosseum collapsed in such a strange, uneven way. If you view it from above, you can see an almost perfect line of separation. On one side, a solid wall. On the other, picturesque ruins. For centuries, rumors circulated that higher powers had done this, punishing the city for the brutal spectacles of its past. But scientists, using modern tools, found a far more grounded explanation. The key lies in what this massive structure stands on. When ancient engineers chose the site, they made a critical mistake, one impossible to detect with the naked eye. The main problem was that the foundation ended up in a trap. The amphitheater was built on the site of a drained lake, and the ground beneath it was highly unstable. Under the northern section, still largely intact, lies a dense layer of limestone, essentially natural concrete that firmly anchors the foundation. But the southern side, where the huge gap now opens, was once a body of water. Builders drained it and poured a deep concrete foundation, but nature proved more cunning. The massive structure, weighing hundreds of thousands of tons, ended up resting on solid ground on one side and on a soft, unstable base on the other. Over the centuries, the soil beneath the southern wall behaved like a sponge. During earthquakes, the northern side remained steady, while the southern side vibrated and shifted. Eventually, a fracture down the middle was inevitable. The first serious damage came in the mid-5th century, when a powerful earthquake shook the city. Walls across Rome cracked, and buildings crumbled into dust. In the Colosseum, dangerous fractures appeared for the first time, and the southern side began to slowly sink. Authorities tried to repair the cracks, but restoring the original strength was impossible. The structure became like a wounded beast, waiting for the final blow. This fragile state lasted for centuries while it was still maintained. But after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the amphitheater was no longer properly cared for and began to deteriorate on its own. The true end of the old Colosseum came in September 1349, when a catastrophic earthquake struck Italy. Tremors lasted for days, and the southern outer wall, standing on weak ground, finally gave way. Thousands of tons of finely cut stone crashed to the ground, filling the area with massive debris. In a single moment, the perfect ring of the amphitheater was broken. This event completely changed how people viewed the monument. If it had once inspired fear or respect, it now became nothing more than a giant dump of free building materials. Residents realized they no longer needed to travel to distant quarries or spend money extracting stone when perfectly cut blocks were lying right under their feet. It was a point of no return, after which the building began to be dismantled piece by piece. Anyone could bring a cart and take home a fragment of history to build a shed or reinforce a fence. But stone wasn't the only prize. As mentioned earlier, the metal embedded in the walls was just as valuable. Interestingly, it was this very earthquake that created the distinctive appearance we now see on postcards. The northern side, resting on solid rock, endured the shocks and remained tall and majestic. The southern side, however, collapsed into a low, broken remnant, exposing its inner corridors. Today, the Colosseum is like the world's largest puzzle, one that engineers and historians across the globe are still trying to piece together. If you stand close to the structure, you'll notice something unusual. Where the outer wall abruptly ends, massive brick buttresses rise up. They look like giant patches on an old coat. These supports were built back in the 19th century because without them, the remaining portion would have collapsed just like the missing half. It was one of the first large-scale restoration efforts in history, when people realized that without immediate intervention, the symbol of Rome would turn into nothing but rubble. But the most remarkable part is happening right now. Modern Rome is a bustling metropolis with subways, buses, and millions of tourists, and this is the main challenge for the ancient stones. Every time a train passes underground, the Colosseum feels a faint vibration. To humans, it's almost imperceptible, but for heavy stone blocks no longer bound by iron clamps, it's a serious threat. The structure quite literally breathes, and these microscopic movements slowly widen existing cracks. To monitor this, scientists have installed hundreds of highly sensitive sensors on the walls. They record every tiny movement in real time. It's like a heartbeat monitor for an ancient giant, watched over by the entire world. Recently, researchers attempted a unique experiment to determine whether the Colosseum could be restored to its original form. The idea sounded promising, but engineers quickly ran into a harsh reality. It turned out that modern materials are simply incompatible with ancient stone. If you fill the gaps with modern concrete, it expands and contracts with temperature differently than ancient limestone, which would tear the walls apart from within. So restorers chose a different approach. They clean the facade using specialized lasers. These beams gently remove layers of soot and smog without damaging the stone itself. Beneath the dark crust of grime, the same pale color emerges, the one Romans saw 2,000 years ago. Interestingly, the missing half of the Colosseum still speaks from time to time. During renovations of old houses in central Rome, workers often uncover massive blocks with the characteristic holes once used for iron clamps. Instead of discarding them, city authorities try to return such finds. Of course, they can't be placed back into the original walls, but they are arranged around the arena as reminders of its former grandeur. Creates a strange feeling. You walk through the city and realize it is literally infused with fragments of the amphitheater. You might sip coffee in a cafe whose foundation was built from stones that once witnessed gladiatorial battles. Is there a mystical connection between the preservation of the Colosseum and the fate of Rome itself? There is an ancient prophecy that says, as long as the Colosseum stands, Rome stands, and when the Colosseum falls, the world will fall. Sounds ominous, but there's a grain of truth in it. For us, this structure has become a measure of our ability to preserve history. We cannot restore the half that was lost to time and human hands, but we have learned to value what remains. The Colosseum is no longer just a ruin. It is one of Italy's most valuable cultural assets, generating billions in revenue. Even in its partially razrushene sostoяние, it proves more useful and valuable than many modern constructions. The mystery of the missing half of the Colosseum is no longer a mystery. It was consumed by necessity, greed, and unforgiving geology. And yet, it is precisely this imperfection, the jagged edges and empty arches, that makes it so recognizable. If it had survived intact, it might look like just another concrete stadium. In its current form, it tells a story of survival. We see not just architecture, but the marks left by time and human hands, and that is what makes it truly alive. The story of the Colosseum's missing half is a vivid example of how even humanity's greatest creations yield to the forces of nature and the practicality of future generations. What began as a geological miscalculation and a series of devastating earthquakes ultimately transformed the amphitheater into a vast source of building material for a new Rome. It turned out that modern materials are simply incompatible with ancient stone. If the voids were filled with modern concrete, it would expand and contract with temperature differently than ancient limestone, eventually tearing the walls apart from within. So restorers chose a different approach. They clean the facade using specialized lasers. These beams gently remove layers of soot and smog without damaging the stone itself. Beneath the dark crust of grime, the same pale color appears, the one Romans saw 2,000 years ago. Interestingly, the missing half of the Colosseum still speaks from time to time. During renovations of old houses in central Rome, workers often uncover massive blocks with the characteristic holes once used for iron clamps. Instead of throwing them away, city authorities try to return such finds. Of course, placing them back into the original walls is no longer possible, but they are arranged around the arena as reminders of its former grandeur. Creates a strange feeling. You walk through the city and realize it is literally infused with fragments of the amphitheater. You might sip coffee in a cafe whose foundation was built from stones that once witnessed gladiatorial battles. Is there a mystical connection between the preservation of the Colosseum and the fate of Rome itself? There is an ancient prophecy that says, as long as the Colosseum stands, Rome stands, and when the Colosseum falls, the world will fall. Sounds ominous, but there's a grain of truth in it. For us, this structure has become a measure of our ability to preserve history. We cannot bring back the half that was lost to time and human hands, but we have learned to value what remains. The Colosseum is not just a ruin. It is one of Italy's most valuable cultural assets, generating billions in revenue. Even in its partially ruined state, it proves more useful and valuable than many modern constructions. The mystery of the missing half of the Colosseum has been solved. It was consumed by necessity, greed, and unforgiving geology. Yet it is precisely this imperfection, the jagged edges and empty arches, that makes it so recognizable. If it had survived intact, it might look like an ordinary concrete stadium. In its current form, it tells a story of survival. What we see is not just architecture, but the marks left by time and human hands, and that is what makes it truly alive. The story of the Colosseum's missing half is a vivid example of how even humanity's greatest creations yield to the forces of nature and the practicality of future generations. What began as a geological miscalculation and a series of destructive earthquakes ultimately turned the amphitheater into a vast source of building material for a new Rome.